Good afternoon, everybody, and happy middle of the summer. I hope you're all doing well and healthy. We are very excited for today's installment of Espresso with Carlo. We are joined by our really dynamic and great district attorney for Brooklyn, aka Kings County, the Honorable Eric Gonzalez. And I'll talk about Eric in just a minute, but I do want to welcome all of you and say thank you in particular to the chair of our board, Elizabeth Velez. And Liz, as you know, is doing such a great job. And Elizabeth, my only regret is that you started as chair in January. We had one big event with 800 people, and then that's it. You haven't been able to host something in person, but it is our hope that that will change soon. But let me thank our chair, Liz Velez, for sponsoring today. And Liz, would you like to say a few words of welcome?
Yes, hi everybody. And Carlo, you talk about your regret is that I only hosted one event for 800. It's my regret too, but you know, these are crazy times, uncertain times. I really appreciate the strength and the voice of the Building Congress as we go through you know, these crises that are affecting our city. So thank you too, and thank you so much for this wonderful platform of Espresso with Carlo, because it really helps keep us engaged on all the areas and things that I think are important to us as businesses, especially in the industry in New York City, especially. So I'm thrilled with today's guest, because often when one thinks of the DA's office or the DA of any area, you know, it's very kind of prosecutorial in nature, you know, not somebody that you'd want to necessarily know. And if you get to know the DA, you might be on the wrong side of the equation in knowing the DA. But I'm so happy that we have a wonderful DA who has dispelled of all those images for me, certainly, of being this prosecutorial in nature, has shown me that the DA's office impacts every part of our life by partnering with our communities, by partnering with our businesses, and certainly by partnering with our city. And I've seen in DA Eric Gonzalez a person who wants to work together with us, with New York City, to make this city safer, fairer, and above all, stronger. And so we need that kind of voice, and we need that kind of presence now more than ever. So I'm thrilled with our guest speaker today, DA Eric Gonzalez. So thank you, Carlo, and back to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for those great words. You know, I can go on and on about our Brooklyn district attorney, but I will not, because we want to get into a dialogue with you today, Eric. But just to say that, you know, Brooklyn has had some phenomenal district attorneys over the years. And of course, we all mourn still, I know I do, and many of us do, the late, great District Attorney Thompson, who really went in there with so much promise and hope and started to do so many incredible things. Unfortunately, his tenure was cut short. But what people may not have realized back then, it was Eric Gonzalez who was really implementing and orchestrating so much of the work, the ideas, and the vision behind the scenes. So when Eric was appointed to be the interim, when the then district attorney passed away, I think it was an obvious choice for those of us that knew the work that you were doing and understood the critical place Brooklyn and the city were, particularly in need of someone with Eric's clear, long history with the office, understanding of the criminal justice system, understanding the reforms that were needed, understanding where Brooklyn was, the place, the time, but always keeping in the back of clearly his mind and his team's mind that we have to keep New York safe. And I think that all together has created a very unique role for District Attorney Eric Gonzalez. So with that, let me welcome our Brooklyn District Attorney. How are you today, Eric? Welcome to Espresso with Carlo.
Good afternoon, Carlo, and thank you for the invitation. I also want to thank Liz for reaching out and making this possible for me to speak to such a distinguished group of, builders and labor leaders and union leaders, because the future of our city is so closely dependent on our ability to revive our economy and the work that all of you do. And I'm going to, hop right into it. But Liz, if you ever give up construction, you want to go into PR for the DA, I'll appreciate that. But I'm Eric Gonzalez. I was the elected DA. I got elected in November of 2017. And as Carlo mentioned, I was allowed to serve as the acting district attorney of Brooklyn in 2016 by Governor Cuomo after DA Ken Thompson sadly passed away. I think it's important that all of you who don't know me know that I've been a prosecutor for 25 years. I grew up in East New York in Brooklyn. I'm a lifelong Brooklynite with the exception of going to law school in Michigan, University of Michigan. I'm a New Yorker through and through, and I love Brooklyn. But I grew up in East New York during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in the 80s and 90s. I lived in a community that was really plagued by gang violence, and drugs were everywhere. My part of Brooklyn was considered the murder capital of New York City, and fear was palpable. And as a young man, I gave great amount of thinking before I left my house about how I would get to the train station, how would I get to the grocery store without being confronted and possibly harmed. And so keeping New York City safe is a big core belief of my soul, because I remember what it was like when you could not leave your house safely. But I became a prosecutor to hope to change that. I also became a prosecutor because I was concerned about the delivery of justice services in many communities. I'm going to hop into this conversation because we're really in a critical time in New York City. There are enormous challenges to our economy, and there are enormous challenges to our justice system. And many of you on this call today are like the tens of thousands of New Yorkers. You were either sick yourself or knew someone who was sick or knew someone who passed away from this devastating disease. As business leaders, you're fully aware of what we're confronting, the gravity of all of the challenges that we face right now. I heard the mayor talk today about operationally planning for the layoff of 22,000 municipal workers. Some of those people will come from offices like mine. And I think it's important that you understand how we've tried to adapt to this crisis. This office, like many other offices, our 1,200 person workforce came to work every day. It was an on-site job. No one worked from home. We were in our courthouses. We were in our communities. It required people to come to work. And all of a sudden the pandemic hit, the courts were closing. I had to make the decision to close down this office. In a very short period of time, we had to figure out how to operationalize and get people to work from home. We were able to set up our lawyers remotely, but we started to take very concrete steps to protect our community, including dealing with victims of crime. We hired a small army of social workers who were responsible for reaching out to vulnerable victims, including victims of gender-based violence and sexual assaults and other victims that really rely on government and social services to safely live in our communities, and make sure that these social workers were stepping in to provide help to these people when most of our government seemingly seemed shut. And so we did really core functions. We did safety planning, we got them food and PPE, sometimes clothing, and worked on alternative housing. We really tried to make sure that although the courts were closed and our police department was largely hurt by COVID and many officers were not available, that we continue to protect witnesses. And for the first time in the state's history, we had prosecutors arraigning cases virtually. In our courthouses, no one was coming to court, but we were able to keep some bad people in jail as necessary through virtual proceedings. And so that was a remarkable build out, but we have not had working grand juries in this county in New York City for almost 5 months. Good news. We got some up and running yesterday in Brooklyn, and we indicted our first cases in about 5 months. We still don't have jury trials, but we're working to build that capacity. The return of court functions is an important piece of public safety, and so I'm happy to see us moving forward. We have thousands of cases that need to be resolved and need to go through the court process. Now, in terms of what we're seeing on the ground, arrests are way down in Brooklyn. If you're looking over a 2-year span, arrests would be down over 50% right now. And if we're just looking at last year to today, arrests are down by 40%. And so that is an issue because we realize that because of COVID, because of the George Floyd protest and Black Lives Matter movement, that our officers were not able to do basic enforcement, and were either dealing with COVID issues and keeping us safe with our protesters. But we are focusing our resources once again now, as we've seen a terrible rise in shootings. And this rise really started mid-March, really became pronounced in May. So from May, really from the middle of May to current, we saw a tremendous rise of shootings and absolute sheer violence in Brooklyn and throughout the city. And I'm going to address that directly. But I want to also quickly just tell you a little bit about things that may be of interest to the New York Building Coalition group, because this office also plays an important role for the Congress in terms of what we do on our labor and construction cases. So we have a unit, I call it a construction and labor fraud unit. We look at investigations of any case where there's a fatality or a serious injury on a work site. We do that work with OSHA, we do it with Department of Buildings, and with Department of Investigations. We also have a few detective investigators that work directly for our office. Currently, we have about a dozen or so investigations actively ongoing. The goal of the unit is to protect worker safety and fairness, quite frankly, in the industry. We're looking to prevent tragedies and avoidable accidents from taking place. And so we'll investigate those cases. And the heart of that is really looking at construction fatalities. We'll look at prevailing wage cases. We'll also look at tax fraud, worker comp fraud, and other insurance frauds. And we're going to spend some time looking at reckless endangerment type cases when you see a collapse or something that happens that should not happen, where the person, the developer or the contractor has really fallen, well beneath industry standards. And so we do this work. I think it's important work, and I think the Building Congress gets a lot out of it because we also, I think, help level the playing field by going after bad actors, the actors who, quite frankly, compete with the honest members, which I believe is the majority of the people that are in the industry. But there are a small number of bad actors who cheat, they underbid, they do things that they know they can never do by following what's required on a job site, or to pay what's required to be paid. And because they do that, they hurt everyone. And so I think we play an important role in keeping a level playing field for good business. And I'm proud of the work we're doing. And if anyone has questions regarding that, let's talk about it. But I really want to jump in on talking about the future of the city and talking about the future of law enforcement. How do we keep New York City safe? How do we deal with some of the conversations that are happening about inequities and unfairness in the delivery of our justice system? And I think in the past, many of you on this call probably thought prosecutors, had an important job, but it was a relatively limited job. We investigated and prosecuted cases that the police department brought us. We have always had a tremendous amount of discretion on how we handle those cases, but there wasn't a lot of attention on the job of the DA. Today's conversations about unfairness and inequities in the justice system have put a spotlight on district attorneys across the country, and maybe rightfully so, but DAs are playing a much more critical and prominent role than they have in the past. I know that the office often feels like it's under a microscope in terms of what we're doing, and I think it's important to have these conversations. Across this country, we're having conversations about the size and role of law enforcement, including here in New York City, about the police department. There's conversations about defunding the police. I think there are conversations about what the appropriate role of a prosecutor should be. And I think these are critical conversations that members of the business community need to be involved in, because sometimes we only hear from one side, when we're not hearing voices that think it's important that we move towards safety. I'm going to be quite honest with this group. The political capital of the police department seems to be diminished in my eyes. Elected officials don't appear to listen to them as often. They don't drive the conversation about legislation and safety as they used to. And often there are decisions seemingly being made where I believe law enforcement hasn't even been consulted. So district attorneys, I think, have to step up. And like myself, we have to play a more prominent role than simply prosecuting cases. We have to help expand and build upon the practices that will keep the city safe, and also work towards ensuring fundamental fairness for all New Yorkers. When I look at what people want in Brooklyn, people want safety and they want fairness. And some of these conversations that are happening are beyond the scope of what average Brooklynites want. But I want to take a step back and look at what's at stake. And to me, what's at stake is public safety is absolutely the bedrock of economic growth in this city. And as the growth of industry, as development happens, and it drives our economy, it also drives down crime. I think it's that simple. As we create more opportunities economically in this city, we get a safer city. So safety and economic growth go hand in glove. And I think now that shootings are up, that we see more homelessness on our streets, that there's a sense that there's quality of life has been diminished in New York. Many believe that there's a necessary trade-off between safety and fairness. I don't share that belief. I actually believe that safety and fairness go together, and that you can have common sense criminal justice reform while keeping our city safe. Now, here in this county, I helped author a Justice 2020 action plan for public safety and for fairness. And I did that with about 75 thinkers and on criminal justice issues. It's a really good report. I'm just going to hold it up here. I'm not going to get into all of the details of this report, but Justice 2020 is an action plan about how you create safety and the sense of fairness in our justice system. And underpinning what we are going to do in this office to drive down crime is that we understand that they're chronic offenders. They're people who repeatedly commit crimes, terrible crimes. And the police department will share this with you, and we share this belief that really there's about 1% of the population that really drive violent crime. Those are our shooters. Those are the people who are doing violent robberies and home invasions. This 1% of the population, we believe, is committing 60 to 70% of the crime. And that's exactly what we've seen with the shootings this summer. The police commissioner has said that there's about 20 to 30 people that have been on the scene at many of the shootings. So it's a small handful of people that are driving the real violence. We know that this violence can be stopped. What we have to do is put all of our resources and all of our commitment into identifying, arresting, and prosecuting and separating these folks from our community. If we do that, we will bring down violence in Brooklyn. Most of this increase, at least in Brooklyn, is directly associated with gang violence. It's terrible because we see young men, mostly men of color, Black and Hispanic men, shooting and killing each other, and that cycle of violence continues. Witnesses are afraid to come forward to testify, and those who may be affiliated with that lifestyle involved in gang activity either don't like the police or don't trust the police, and so they're not going to come forward. That's nothing new. I have to be honest. We've seen that before. In 2014, when my predecessor took office, we had a spike in violence in Brooklyn. We were able to reduce that violence. And I should say, during the years that I've been the DA, I've been able to reduce violent crime in Brooklyn, in particular, homicides by a third and shootings by nearly 40%, by really focusing on these chronic offenders. I call them drivers of crime, but these are dangerous people. And if we focus on them and we take them off the streets, all of us are better for it. Now, the pandemic, as I said, hurt basic law enforcement. We had 20%, maybe 25% of the police department out because of COVID. And then right after COVID, we started to see the protests. And court operations were down, and really the delivery of social services and things that keep the city safe had really taken a hit. We will hold these folks responsible. We will figure out who did these shootings. We're going back and working to identify people. We will end this bleeding, because we have to. I was at the hospital when the one-year-old was shot and killed in Brooklyn. I spoke with the grandmother, I spoke with the father. The mother had left the hospital because she was so distraught. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. I went to her house, I was speaking to her, she still had blood all over her, had her son's blood all over her. We have to prevent this. And we can do this by focusing in on drivers in ways that have not been done in a long time. I know there's been a lot of resistance to using techniques, including surveillance techniques that can identify these folks, but we have to figure out who these folks are. And in Brooklyn, we have a list that we've been working with the police department to get these cases now into our grand jury. So you're going to see immediate action from this office. We're going to go after some of the purveyors of these guns. You all know that these guns aren't manufactured in New York. They're all brought up and given and sold in these communities. We're going to make some important gun arrests as well. So there's a lot that's going to happen to reduce the violence. But I also want to say this, I think many of you know that I consider myself a reform-oriented prosecutor. This doesn't mean, and my commitment to reduce violent crime does not mean that we have to abandon all common sense reforms of our justice system. And we must continue best practices such as fighting opioid epidemic with treatment and drug counseling and not with jail. We have to reduce inequities in our justice system that are gross and that really undermine community and public trust in our system. We have reentry programs that have to be supported because we have folks coming home from jail. And if we don't want them to reoffend, we have to make sure that they have services and that we help provide, get them jobs. And we have to really work on people returning home from prison. Every year, thousands of people are returning home to our communities from jail, and we have to continue to work on building those reentry services. We have young people who commit a lot of low-level crime. We have to work with our young people, and I am very committed to trying to divert or deflect some of these young people out of our justice system when reasonably able to do so without jeopardizing public safety. And it has to be meaningful diversion. Diversion that's meant to get them jobs or have them pursue education so they can become dynamic young people that we all want them to be, that they can be part of our city without causing harm, and they can hopefully be part of your workforce. This diversion of young people, I think, is critical. And then finally, mental health services. 40% of the people that I deal with in my job in criminal prosecution have a significant mental health issue. When we have to figure out other options for these people who are struggling with mental health issues, and there's not enough resources that have been put into that. Last month, I issued a report with the Innocence Project on wrongful convictions, and I think that wrongful convictions speak a lot to the type of reforms I'm talking about. No one can think a wrongful conviction is appropriate or useful in keeping us safe. We issued this report with the Innocence Project. It's called 426 Years, an examination of 25 wrongful convictions in Brooklyn. It's a historic report. Anyone who's interested, will send it to you. It's groundbreaking, had never been done, but it really looks at 25 wrongful convictions that took place right here in Kings County in Brooklyn over a 30-year period. Almost all the men convicted, but one, were either Black or Hispanic. There was one woman who was wrongfully convicted of murder as well. And it explains why those convictions went wrong and what were the structural and systemic issues that need to be changed to prevent this from ever happening. It's titled 426 Years, quite frankly, because that's the amount of time these 25 people spent in jail on these cases collectively. 3 of those men spent decades in jail and never got out because they died in prison. So it's a tragedy, it's a human tragedy. It was completely avoidable, and we're working very diligently to make sure our justice system never fails our communities like that. Again, not only did we convict the wrong person, but we never held the true offender accountable. And so anyone interested in doing this, reading about this, I'm happy to send it to you. But what I'm saying to you is we can't go backwards. We can't go backwards in terms of crime, but we can't go backwards and abandon the kind of common sense reform that was desperately needed. And I introduced myself talking about the 80s and 90s because those were high crime years, decades. And we made a lot of mistakes in law enforcement in our effort to fight crime during that period of time. Too many people went to jail on non-violent offenses, and those cases should have been handled differently. So I divert young people whenever I can, if I can do so safely, and I'm trying to get them into jobs and education. And I think as business leaders here, you can support smart and fair reform through internships, through apprenticeships, through trainings, and critically through jobs. And if you're interested in helping create a pipeline that diversifies workforces, because many of the people that are either coming home from reentry or in our diversion programs are people of color, we're being challenged like never before. But I believe in the building Congress and the work that you do. I believe in New York City. I love this city. And we're not going to go backwards. We're going to do I'm going to put every resource I have at my disposal to stop the bleeding from continuing and to push back our numbers. But I need help. I need places to send folks who we think could be saved and become productive. And I hope that we can work on a pipeline to figure this out together. But I stand ready to partner with all of you because I understand that I play a very critical role in the success of this city in keeping us safe and thereby making it possible for you to do all the work that you do. Thank you, Carlo. And
Thank you. Okay. So first of all, I think the reason you and your office are successful is really based on what you just talked about. And I just want to stress something that I think we agree on. and that is you can reduce crime and keep New York safe, and yet treat people fair and with respect. And I think that's something that you can really play a big role, not just in Brooklyn, but really throughout the state and the country in making what those examples are. I think, you know, for our world and the business community, the people in the building industry, I think you said it best a few minutes ago. If we want the economy to continue to grow, to create jobs, people have to feel safe. And I think the perception sometimes is equal or worse than the reality of what's happening. What is your office doing, if anything, to help New Yorkers understand that we are not living in 1992 right now? It's not 3,000 or 2,500 murders a year. And, you know, how are we going to really show people what reality is, and what can you do to lead that conversation? And how?
Well, perception often is reality. If people don't feel safe, you know, going in, and I've been at a lot of meetings where the police will come into a room full of people who feel unsafe about a recent incident in their neighborhood, and the police or the mayor would say, you know, the safest big city in America, look at our numbers, look at our stats. And I can tell you, last year at the end of 2019, we had the fewest number of shootings in Brooklyn's history, right? So the numbers are supportive of a very safe society. However, if people don't feel safe, then for all intents and purposes, they're not. And we've seen it in different ways. We saw it in sort of hate crimes that took off last year in 2019 in parts of Brooklyn and Manhattan and elsewhere where people were afraid to leave their homes. We have to address the concerns of our residents. And I think that one of the unfortunate things that has happened is that members of our community no longer feel that they can call 911 or some version of government to talk about community concerns or quality of life concerns, that the sense is that the police are out of the business of doing that. And we need to deal with that. We have to address that because people need to be able to have response. So whether it's the fireworks that most recently happened, right? The sense is that, you know, government has to step in. And one of the obligations of government, quite frankly, is to make sure our community is safe. I know what I can do in terms of prosecution of cases. I know that we can also help play a very critical role in being responsive to the needs of community. And so you're going to see that there's going to be a lot of efforts ongoing to work with community-based organizations and other people who are seemingly left to dealing with a lot of these issues of quality of life. Many of our leaders are saying call 311 and we'll figure out appropriate responses to noise complaints and other complaints. But in terms of pure violence, it has to be clear that we're not going to accept it, that we are not going to condone it, and that we are going to hold people accountable for their actions. And I think that during the pandemic, quite frankly, there were a lot of people who took advantage because they knew the police were unable to respond. They were unable to respond because they were out sick and a lot of them weren't available. They were unable to respond because right after the pandemic, and it wasn't safe for them to do a lot of things that they normally did. But there was also an accountability that wasn't happening because we became very good at solving cases through video surveillance and other techniques. But with everyone wearing the mask and gloves, we saw a lot of shootings and a lot of other things that happened that were not resulting in any arrest. You know, we weren't solving cases. That spiraled into ongoing gang warfare. And I think increasingly and ironically, more people in those neighborhoods carrying guns because they felt they needed it for safety. And so we are going to do gun buybacks. We're going to go after some suppliers. We're going to make people understand that if they're involved in violence, that there's going to be a price to be paid for doing that. And so in my office, we have a violent crime enterprise unit, a VCE unit. We have a crime strategies unit. And just last week, I created a gun suppression unit that's going to focus in on gun crimes. And so I think the combination of all of this together will have an impact on bringing down guns, and we have to do a little bit more to support our police. And I think everyone plays a role in that.
Right. And I think we all have to be in this together to make it work. You talked a little bit about the reentry task force. I think it sounds like something that the building industry and your office need to do a better job coordinating with. Can you give us a little sense of how it works, what some of your goals are with that task force?
Well, about 5,000 people a year come back to Brooklyn from state prison. They've paid their debt to society. Some of them have been there for a really long time, some of them for not so long. Some of them have made the necessary cognitive behavioral changes to be productive citizens. And, we work with those people to help reestablish them in society. The sad fact is that, about 50% of the people who return home to homelessness. They no longer have a home. They've been separated from their family units. Their families can't either afford to take them back or don't want them back. They don't have jobs and really have any education. And so there's an investment that needs to be made in these people if we want them to be successful, if we want them not to go back to what got them sent to prison in the first place. There has to be resources. So my office, out of my budget, we work on reentry with them. We help do job training and some social work and skills. I mean, these people come home from prison. They don't have driver's licenses. They don't have birth certificates. They're really sort of been, sort of warehoused and out of the system. And so we try to reestablish them. We try to get them driver's licenses and birth certificates and things, and then work with organizations and groups to get them employment. And I think, if the Building Congress and other people, and most of them, 50% of them or more, are interested in construction because that's just what they think they can do. If we could work on a pipeline where the best and, folks that we think are ready to and committed to reforming their lives could help get job skills and training and internships and experience, it would go a very long way in making sure that they're successful. And I'm hopeful that we can do it. And I know that the Building Congress is concerned of issues of equity, WMBEs and MBEs and those things. And here's a workforce that I think could be used in ways that would, be good for us in terms of safety and fairness, but in terms of the look that New York City is actually treating all New Yorkers and providing opportunity for all New Yorkers. So whatever we can do together would be great.
Well, we have a foundation, and we work with a lot of groups and support them financially and in other ways. But I think that offline, we will reach out to your office and set up some time to learn about this, because I think this can be a life-changing situation for so many people and can stop some of them from going back and possibly doing something else that they shouldn't be doing. And I think this is how we can really assist your office in keeping crime down.
And not only from our reentry folks, but quite frankly, in our diversionary track, there are people who have no criminal records, who've never been in prison, who have all the opportunity and potential in front of them, who, if we can just, get a job, it's likely to keep them out of trouble.
Agreed. One of the questions we have from one of our listeners is with court cases resuming and courts reopening, how is your office working to keep people safe with the COVID and the continued cases that are out there?
So there's a tremendous backlog of cases, well over 3,000 cases that came in through COVID that have not had any opportunity to be heard in court. What we've done is we've looked at every one of these cases, we've assigned them to prosecutors, and we've created a scale from 1 to 5. And 1 being the most urgent critical cases for public safety, to make sure that those cases are demanding and getting the attention they need from our judges. Our judges only recently started to hear cases again. Most of them are not hearing cases live. Most of it is still virtual, but there is a reopening of the courts so we can have live presentations of cases to judges. And so we want to make sure those cases are being handled first, the most critical, by our judges. And then in our grand jury, those are the ones that we're asking our grand jury to hear first. These are the cases where we think, important supervision over these defendants need to happen in our courthouse. And those cases have to move forward. And so we're going to push those first. And then in terms of, as we get down, the line, as we get to level 5 cases, those are maybe cases that we don't need to come to court, and we can figure out other solutions to those cases. And maybe they're possible plea bargains, and then maybe they're cases that we can send to our community for restorative justice practices, which, a lot of these are maybe neighbor disputes or a low-level offending that maybe you don't need a judge to hear this case, but you need that case to have an outcome, and you need that case, the person who committed harm in that case, to the sense that there's been some accountability for what they did.
One of the most horrible parts of COVID has been the rise in domestic violence. Can you tell us a little bit about how your office is handling that and what can be done?
Yeah, it's a great question, because domestic violence was one of the only crimes where we saw an actual increase in. Mostly, we've seen the rise in shootings and a rise in homicides, and that was, most recently from mid-May to now. But during the heart of COVID, when many people were trapped home with their abusers and could not get help the way normally domestic violence victims and survivors can, telling a friend, making a phone call, going to work, going to school, and reporting, they were stuck home. And we saw a real rise in this issue of domestic violence. We've been working very closely with the courts to make sure that orders of protection got extended, even though the courts weren't meeting, so that we had valid orders of protection. We made sure that we were providing social services to these victims so that they could safely report. We're working with different organizations, Safe Horizons, and other organizations who were providing, unfortunately, homeless shelters for people that were COVID safe because they needed to get out of their location. We did some relocations of individuals, but largely we used our network of social workers to make sure that people didn't feel trapped and desperate. And so during this period of COVID, we spent a lot of time reaching out to domestic violence survivors and victims and ongoing cases to make sure that that they weren't continuously being abused. But we saw this as a problem in other places, in other countries. Even after COVID was completely over, all the built up frustration from loss of job and family drama and people having lost their lives and all the stressors and tensions have really led to an increase in violence. So even though New York City is doing well, in terms of where we are in COVID at this moment, we know that those stressors are out there and so many people are unemployed. These are the things that lead to domestic violence. And so we have an active social media campaign and an active working with our police department to do home visits to make sure people are safe. And if anyone wants more resources, I think I have one of the best domestic violence operations in the city. We help about 10,000 gender-based victims a year.
That's great. A couple more questions about virtual court hearings. I think people want to understand a little bit more about what that means and how your office feels about them.
Well, I mean, the virtual court hearings are not my preference. They were necessary because, we could not get thousands of people into our courthouses on a daily basis, or even hundreds of people in our courthouses especially during the heart of COVID. A virtual appearance is exactly what it is. The judge was, you know, wherever they were, probably in their home. Our prosecutors were doing most of that from their offices, but no one was coming to court. And the defendants were either be on Zoom or Skype, and the case would get called and just sort of a check-in. I think it was important that the courts created that system so that at least there was some activity happening, but nothing beats being in court in person. And so we're not completely there, Carlo, by any stretch of the imagination, but we're starting to build that capacity. The governor changed the law, which was important because prior to the governor changing the law, and it wasn't that long ago, less than 2 months ago, he changed the law, 6 weeks ago, we were not able to do any work on Zoom. But we could have the court appearance, but we were not allowed to take plea bargains virtually over the computer. We were not allowed, the judge was not allowed to do sentencing. It was really just a check-in. So now the law has been changed to allow the courts to actually do real work virtually, and it's made a difference because the judge was finally able. We had about 300 people who were supposed to be in jail. They had pled guilty. Their cases were scheduled for them to go to jail. Now, during COVID, the courts were reluctant to send them to jail during the heart of the COVID crisis, which was actually pretty significant in Rikers Island. But when that waned, the courts didn't have the legal authority to send them to jail and have the sentence done virtually. And so the governor fixed that. And so that's an important step. So we're making progress, but there's more to be done.
We have a couple of minutes left, and I do want to let you have a couple of minutes to say some final remarks. But, we're going through a census right now. And unfortunately, Brooklyn is not leading the way, which we would like to see happen a little bit better. What are you guys doing to help push that out there on the census?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm out there. One of the things that I hope everyone on this call knows is that I'm active. I'm not sitting simply behind a desk. I go out to the community. I go out to crime scenes. I speak with victims of crime. I want to be involved in, being a servant leader in many aspects. Like I'm out there listening and helping. And so this office has done a lot to do and to provide PPEs and to deliver food, and we've done much. We've done thousands of meals to build some trust in our justice system. But the census is so important because so now I've been out there, on census rallies and the marches and encouraging people to fill it out. But as we're having these conversations about the role of the police, seemingly more and more, we expect communities to be problem solvers. And without the resources from the federal government, we all know we pay a lot of money in taxes to our federal government. We have a tremendous undercounting in Brooklyn. I think we're only at, like, last time I checked, 53% response rate. It may have been up a little bit because we've been doing door knocking. But we were undercounted, we were undercounted the last time it was done. They say our population is about 2.5 million. We know it's more. We know there's a tremendous undercount of immigrant and undocumented individuals. So we're losing money and we're losing resources for, schools and housing and social services. As DA, I can tell you that I'm often, unfortunately, able to see who's going to wind up before me as a defendant based on what zip code they live in and what communities live in neighborhoods that are impoverished with poor schools and lack of services. They're more likely to wind up at my desk than someone who lives in Park Slope, let's say, or in Brooklyn Heights. And so we need to get those resources to these communities. This money is owed to us by our federal government. And not for in any minor, small way. But if we lose political power in DC, if we lose one of our Congress members or two of our Congress members, which is what's been reported to possibly happen in New York State, upstate, but what about in New York City? We're going to lose people fighting for us to get federal dollars to help our economy. If we don't deal with this eviction moratorium and help get money to do, large projects, these sort of government, these big projects that, could benefit all of you, but also have our workers, we're going to see more crime, because these are the hallmarks: unemployment, bad schools, lack of family connections. These are the hallmarks of crime. There are very few people who have all the benefits of society, all the privileges of society, and wind up committing these terrible acts. So this, to me, the census is about resources. It's also about political power, but it's also, quite honestly, at the end of the day, it's going to allow me to have the ability to figure out how we keep people safe. The solution is not going to be jail for everyone. It's going to have to be having more ability to deal with them before they commit, a terrible crime.
Agreed. Well, we are almost at 4 o'clock, so I want to say thank you because this has been amazing. And when we invited you to speak, a couple of people had emailed me and said, "Well, you're the building industry. What does the district attorney have to do with the building industry?" And I hope for those of you watching and listening, you really can see how we are so tied together. And Eric, I want to thank you for being a friend, for being such a great leader, not just in Brooklyn, but in the city. I know you have a busy schedule. I know you have your hands full. I know a lot of moving pieces all at once, but I know that you have the strength and the perseverance to get the job done. So we thank you for that.
Well, I thank you, Carlo. Listen, I know that your membership love this city. They could be building and they could be developing and designing across, this country and maybe across this, world, but they choose largely to make this home because they care about this place. And so do I. And so we need to come together and put our resources collectively behind a safer but more just criminal justice system.
Well, that sounds great. And again, to our chair, Liz Velez, thank you so much for all your help and support. Have a great day, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Our next guest very soon. Enjoy the day.